Just prior to Ukraine's invasion by Russia with great triumph, China announced an endless friendship with Russia. Friendship meant a future of intimate cooperation between the two nations in exchange of energy and possibly the majority of specifically security for longer than 2 years following the conflict. The significance and analysis of this limitless commitment has now drastically changed. Recently, there has been a lot of debate in Chinese society regarding Beijing's cooperation with Moscow. Differences among Chinese citizens and the leadership has promoted a more structured alliance with Russia, but others have adopted a more circumspect posture. The once widely used language of infinite inconspicuously friendship has vanished from China's joint China-Russia statement. Once had a very powerful military collaboration in geostrategic and economic areas. Much of this continues with Russia. Powerful today, but the worldwide implications of Russia's severe changes to nuclear policy conflicted with the way China views the economic ecosystem. It aimed to establish the actions taken by Russian banks and economic entities to conceal themselves behind China in order to avoid Western sanctions, as well as put pressure on China in the international arena. Russia's collaboration with North Korea exerted tremendous pressure on China. In Asia-Pacific as well as in the China was always pushed in the global arena into a precarious situation where it had to pay both Russia's penalty by now, both economically and geopolitically. China's lobbyists had had enough of Russia, and progressively the voices saying, "Enough is enough," were raised. So what has caused China's growth? Tired of Russia and moved its foreign measures that oppose Putin, or was Putin losing the person he believes to be his above all? What will make a difference? A shift in how the two interact. Nations on the conflict in Ukraine and the world weighs Beijing's reaction to the Russian president's recent visit. It was striking how composed Vladimir Putin was. Attempted to curry favor by saying they shared a brotherly bond, but sees the response was more surface level. Reasons behind the re-evaluation of the first is the cooperation between China and Russia. Growing suspicion on the part of the Chinese on the capabilities of the Russian state. The last year's rebellion by the Wagner Group and Ukraine's recent involvement in Russia's territory has resulted in Beijing has conducted critical re-evaluations of stability of Moscow's politics and armed forces readiness and expanding Russian opposition to the war. The Wagner insurrection reflected Russia's internal security and internal conflicts problems. Experts have observed that each Russia has encountered both internal and outside crises throughout its history. Its regimes have lost some of their stability. The Chinese government most likely felt the same way and came to the realization that Russia was the second reason as being less trustworthy. For the shifting dynamics between the two nations and China's slow change trade with China outside of Russia, slow economic growth and inadequate trade with. Additionally, Russia has emphasized how both nations rely on the West for their needs. China-Russia trade hit a record high of US $240 billion in 2023, but the worth of commerce slowed considerably this year. Chinese financial institutions were looking for China as working to reduce ties with Russia. This trade network's primary driver, the relationship, is still mostly in Beijing's favor. Russia is responsible for just 4% of China's commerce, whereas China is for roughly 22% of Russia's commerce. China can therefore change its trade connection with Russia in any direction that is in line with its interests. Russia, according to experts, can use natural gas as well as additional energy sources leveraged to oversee this trade network. A lot of Chinese experts are now cautioning against relying too much on Russia and urging greater collaboration with nearby nations instead of this. Represents a current worry that Russia is making use of its natural resources as a bargaining chip to get additional advantages. At the moment, Russia's export from China deliveries of natural resources for energy to China alone cannot exert enough pressure. China's trade is another factor. For China's increasing disillusionment with Putin's expanding power and Russia's lack of effectiveness on the global stage, there is mounting worry that China's outlook for the world does not match. The deputy director of Xiaolong of Russia from the Shanghai Institute of International Relations holds the view that there is a notable distinction between their worldview, which results in an impossible void that stops a more robust China-Russia partnership. According to international strategists, mutual mistrust is very strong on. Russia has not committed to regional security in order to assist China in the case of a Taiwan dispute. Similar to China's chose not to participate in the Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as Ukraine is stuck and China's worth as a military ally is becoming more and more doubted. Sources near Beijing assert that each time China has historically, attempts were made to form an alliance, Russia has resulted in adverse implications for China. Therefore, experts say it is vital for China to continue to have a long-term collaboration with Russia without diminishing its beneficial ties with Western. Russia have benefited without a doubt from the ongoing conflict between China and the US, as it has attempted to utilize the rivalry to advantages, but this has also resulted in uncertainty in Russia and China relationship due to Russia's dependence could isolate China and susceptible, and this is not a circumstance. China is interested in participating in the Beijing's leadership is unwilling to confront the impact of issues like these caused by. For each of these reasons, China has just started a fantastic activity with its main financial institutions to get rid of, considering how negative Russia is propagating the China One central bank. Among the biggest banks in the world, institutions have allegedly disconnected undenominated transfers made between nations thought to be exporting to Russia in order to stop Russian, preventing importers from attempting to avoid us. Russian media had reported sanctions. That 98% of Chinese banks declined to handle transactions denominated in yen pertaining to this circumstance, and Russia has produced a tremendous impact on Russia. It was the China had for the first time enforced such a severe economic obstacle facing Russia, but this did so through its central bank. Not get along with certain businesses. Russians living in China and Russia traders have reported increased dissatisfaction with Chinese banks postponing or even rejecting cross-border deals, and the young traders were cautious about breaking the secondary sanctions set by the Biden administration's stance on Russia. The invasion of Russia by President Vladimir Putin. The sanctions against Ukraine were directed at goods such as devices that could assist the war machine of Russia, and a few Chinese entrepreneurs were also impacted, as some Chinese exporters as a solution are believed to have delivered goods through third nations that are amicable to Russia, including Kazakhstan, the United UAE, but money received from these countries are currently being examined more closely. Deputy Vladimir Donchenko, in close proximity member of the legal committee of the Association of Importers and Exporters, mentioned a recent transaction in which one UAE-based company tried to send money from the Bank of Kazakhstan. Special thanks to J.J. Chuo of China. The transfer from Commercial Bank was blocked by Bank of China, acting as the bank intermediary for center credits. He said the requirements of Zhang Chojo Commercial Bank transfers from Kazakhstan will be executed only by means of banks that it has correspondent. Maxim Spassky, Secretary of Social Relations, Russian Asian Council, General Council, Industrialists Union, and Entrepreneurs, stressed that the Bank of China, the world's fourth largest by the sum of the assets of big Chinese in particular, banks have adopted rigorous compliance procedures to prevent potential fines. In accordance with Spassky, the smallest hint of compromise, Chinese banks right away declined to handle the payment. As Maxim Spassky mentioned, payments for non-essential items are often handled by smaller Chinese, while bank transactions are more prone to draw unwelcome attention, are being blocked more frequently from Washington. Moreover, Sofia Baspalova, an international project expert at Russian law firm CLS, attested to the fact that business bank Zhang Chojo has been denying payments in cross-border yuan for months. Hongjiang's Harbin Bank in the north, the province, has similarly limited transfers from foreign nations. Baspalova NSB partner Aram Grigorian said another Russian legal firm stated that Chinese these days, banks need more approvals, even for payments between both internal and external reports of the transfer places another client with the same obstacle that Russian importers must overcome to get around China's sanctions. The actions taken against Russia were not restricted to it. Has been reported that these Chinese banks cut back on their Russian holdings as Moscow was subject to sanctions because Vladimir Putin, president's extensive. The invasion of Ukraine is still ongoing. Trade between the economic allies. Frank Media is a Russian business news agency, stated that the Bank of China decreased its 37% increase in Russian assets to $3.9 billion during the second quarter of the Industrial and Commercial Bank in 2024. Of China's assets dropped by 27% to $5.1 billion because of escalating issues with compensation based on turnover. Smaller institutions moved in the table. Reverse of this policy's direction, two smaller Chinese institutions, China Agriculture and Construction Bank, the bank's Russian assets increased by 9% and 27%, respectively, but Chinese banks are notorious for slowing down business growth in Russia as a result of prolonged issues with settlement between the nations and all of the problems we face. Been explaining to you that China is, in fact, becoming less involved. Russia, which is one of the reasons why all suddenly, she is progressing and more distant from Putin and in diminishing the reason for economic and trade ties is the modifications made to Russia's nuclear doctrine following President Vladimir Putin's approval. A novel approach to the application of Russia's significant nuclear weapons stockpile. The Chinese government stated that the nuclear powers ought to exercise more moderation in the present circumstances. All parties involved should maintain composure and self-control, and collaboratively work to ease tensions and reduce strategic risks by using dialogue and speaking with Chinese foreign. According to ministry spokesperson Lin, at a routine press conference in Beijing, the Putin had issued an order the day before that might alter the nuclear assault threshold seen by his nations. According to the update, the armed forces released by Putin shortly after Ukraine obtained permission to dismiss us supplied munitions on Russian soil. The strategic forces of Russia could use nuclear weapons against a state that isn't nuclear. The Kremlin stated that if the aid was justified, Russian nuclear deterrence would continue, opposing a possible enemy, but that using nuclear would continue to be a drastic measure. Step in efforts to reduce threats. It has also been uncomfortable on the Chinese side, given this circumstance, and has issued a warning. Russia's anti-nuclear rhetoric just weeks prior to the full-scale Ukraine's invasion almost 3 years ago. The other three were joined by China and Russia, permanent members of the United Nations Security, UK, France, and the US Council, in stating that a nuclear conflict could not be won and ought never to be fought because the Chinese at the beginning of the war leadership has reiterated the joint January statement 2022. These actions were occasionally perceived as a reaction to sporadic cautions about nuclear conflict between the Kremlin and its allies. Beijing has additionally expressed its discontent with the US's approach to what called extended deterrence, which demands that the US make use of its nuclear shield to protect non-nuclear South Korea and other allies under armed treaties. In Japan, the two nations are both among the regional neighbors of China. Russia may be the target of a nuclear warning to stop the United States from Japan and South Korea's cooperation in the area by providing military assistance to them. Up until now, Washington has rejected calls from Chinese conversation partners to embrace the no-use policy as a pledge, refusing to employ nuclear weapons as a either first strike or preventive in reaction to an attack that is conventional. Moscow gave up on the no first use policy early doctrine 1990s, but the sides of the US and China have made an effort to boost confidence on strategic concerns by sharing information regarding Beijing's nuclear program testing of missiles in late September and at the beginning of this month. Washington, together with these initiatives, the new US induction of President Donald Trump and tighter penalties against Russia are some of the precautions that might deter Putin from employing nuclear armaments. Since Russia invaded the US and UK in February 2022 in Ukraine and Australia, Canada, the EU, and Japan has enforced more than 16,500 sanctions imposed by the US on Russia, and Ukraine supporters reacted to Russia's 2-year-old invasion with an unheard of sanctions. They set a cap on Russian oil prices. Exports stopped making $300 billion in Russia's foreign exchange reserves and cut numerous ties between Russia's banks and the remainder of. After Donald Trump took office, the world could impose additional penalties and additional limitations to stop Putin from reaching for nuclear weapons, but thus far, Russian President Vladimir Putin has not demonstrated to the world that he will take a reputable stance on this matter. Regardless of the US and Chinese campaigns in order to stop the spread and utilization of China's recent nuclear weapons warnings regarding the nuclear issue, Putin's vital to controlling Russia's there is still enough capacity for nuclear weapons. Russia is tempting to start a world crisis by most likely aware that with such actions, it is cutting ties with China and growing more and more alone. But Putin requires a trump card in order to counter the indeed. There are some instances in the West. Russia's ancient use of China for its personal gain. China's strategic the bumpy surface contributes to insecurity. The two nations shared history, which witnessed the more powerful Russian Empire and Soviet Union exploits a less powerful. However, the current state of both China and countries have undergone significant change. For persistent structural elements in Russia are escalating concerns about and increasingly China's might could be detrimental to its interests. as well as take advantage of Moscow's concerns, are exacerbated by a calculated culture that echoes these deep-rooted power aspirations and is uneasy. Being a junior partner in a partnership relationship with China at the moment, strong ties between China and Russia is a notable divergence from history that has frequently seen the greater neighbor abusing the 19th century weakest nation. The Russian Empire was a host in numerous unfair treaties that made China turn over land funds and other loot. To Treaty of 1858 between European powers, the 1860 Treaty of Ping and Lyon were especially severe, making China lose approximately 1 million square kilometers of midway through the 20th century. Territory tensions between the recently formed Republic of China's people and with the Soviet Union turned into the Sinos split of the Soviet Union that lasted until the 1980s. The two nations' long-standing border conflicts were a major source of hostility during the conflict in 1969, escalated along the border into nuclear posture and came close to causing extensive confrontation between the two. Moscow also exerted pressure on communist powers Beijing in other areas, including denouncing Chinese persecution in Tibet and obliquely calling for Tibetan independence. After normalization, ties between China and Russia in 1989 officially ended their lengthy border conflict, and Moscow started to declare neutrality or support for Taiwan and other delicate Chinese issues, Shanghai and Tibet. But Moscow's years of animosity continued to be a source of China's suspicion of the unequal agreements in which Russia participated were central to China's century-old humiliation that the Communist Party of China Party continues to use as an origin of nationalist fervor. It was not feasible to take Russia away from this legacy in a number of ways. These were still observed by Chinese intellectuals. Historical occurrences as proof of Russia is prepared to utilize its might to seek its personal objectives at China's expenditure, and many people in China stayed concerned about Russia's dependability as a strategic partner. In addition to the historical elements that remain structural, additional elements that cause frictions in the connection. The most important of these is geography of Russia's closeness to China generates competitive dynamics, and especially in their common neighborhood in Central Asia, the far east of Russia and the Arctic. Essentially, China's enormous size and strength make it a dangerous neighbor. If the relationship between Beijing and the Moscow declined following the Sin's revelation, China's presence at the Russian border in 1988 appeared in the far east of Russia as a relationship irritant, such as China's Chinese workers, and the economy expanded. Many businesses flocked to the area, entered the field of agriculture. In 2018, a study discovered that about Chinese nationals owned or leased an agricultural area of 3,500 square kilometers. This amounted to, in the far east of Russia, roughly 16% of all land utilized for Chinese agriculture's presence. Anger among the region's workers. Several Russians, many of whom complain that workers from China are taking advantage of and stealing Russian jobs. In contrast, Russian natural resources. Yet Russia and China also have to deal with dynamics of competition in their common Central Asia's backyard that might be Moscow is still a source of tension. Important in the 5 former Soviet Central Asian states, including Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkey, Tajikistan and the United States, and observes the area as a privileged domain of Russia's influence. Up to this point has been ready to tolerate the actions of China, for instance, by collaborating with Beijing in the China LED Shanghai Cooperative Group, and by not the Belt and Road Initiative. Russian initiative goals are now being realized. Even the presence of China has certain advantages. In the area, China's substantial there, economic involvement is beneficial. Encourage stability in the region and progress, and enables Russia to concentrate more about forming its military and security dynamics. But China is also boosting its economic and security impact throughout Central Asia in ways that could Moscow be viewed through in 2021 will see a more competitive lens. Revealed China would construct in its police special forces outpost in Tajikistan, even though it was known that there would be no Chinese military presence. Beijing's action was perceived by some as an action to impair Putin's relations with a participant in the Russian Treaty Organization for Collective Security and the location of the biggest Russian overseas China's military base. Swiftly, Russia was surpassed as the biggest trading partner of the 5 states in Central Asia. Kazakhstani imports into China in 2000. The Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan constituted less than 25% of Russia's. However, in 2020, imports were more than China exports, twice as much as Russia imports. Have also gone up by $19.3 billion. Quantity of Chinese goods delivered to 2020 saw Central Asia follow this pattern. China continues to threaten to make it more difficult for Russia to use its economic influence in the area. China's ambitions are a concern for Russia, and Russia's substantial influence in the Arctic concerns 1/10 of Russia's enormous. It is located inside the Arctic Circle. Its area exceeds 24,000 square kilometers of coastline, and it is the location of roughly 2.5 million individuals. Under Vladimir, Russia under Putin has made the Arctic a crucial focus. Areas such as reviving Russia's military participation in Russia has recently renovated 50 military installations from the Soviet era that were closed, outposts with 10 radars and 13 air bases stations, 10 border posts, and 20 integrated emergency rescue stations. Even though there isn't any land in the Beijing government's goal in the Arctic establish itself as a state close to the Arctic. A white paper on the Arctic published in 2018, China stated its intention to construct in the Arctic Silk Road will supplement them. More broadly, Russia and China have so far collaborated on energy projects and infrastructure initiatives in the area, but there have been notable obstacles. At first, Russia disagreed with China's involvement as an observer in the Moscow Multilateral Arctic Council, continues to have doubts about Beijing's strategic aspirations within the area, and Russia banned Chinese arch vessels in 2012. By carrying out surveys along the Northern Sea route, and Russian prosecutors accused a prominent Russian Arctic specialist convicted of treason for allowing secret data to China, and Russia might feel compelled in the future to oppose the expanding influence of China in these regions as China works to increase its power on a regional and global scale. It might additionally state its interests over Russia's, specifically the economic, military, and cultural ties between the pair of nations may become an intense rivalry, so ungrateful for